One of the most talked about micro brands that I've seen online in quite some time is Baltic, and it seems to be discussed amongst all sorts of different people. People who are focused on affordable watches, but also people who are focused on luxury watches. Well, now I have one in hand. Are they actually worth talking about? Hello, you're watching James. My name's James, you're watching me, and I'm talking about watches. And today I'm talking about a French micro brand called Baltic. Now, Baltic is a brand which seems to be getting a lot of attention, and there's something about them that I actually quite like, and that is how upfront they are about their watches, where they get them from, how they're put together, and where are the parts actually sourced from. Because they're very upfront in regards to buying all their parts, getting all their parts made, machined, and supplied to them from Hong Kong. They then say that they then put them together, they assemble them, and they adjust the movements in France. But they also tell you further that some of their accessories are made and produced in Italy. So they're quite upfront to say, yes, we're a micro brand, yes, we're a French micro brand, but we're not doing it all in France, and we're not pretending to do it all in France. Now, this seems to be a micro brand that is absolutely focusing on sort of vintage inspired watches, which I'm very happy about because I like vintage watches. I like vintage inspired watches. But this watch here, well, if you're going to buy it, it's going to cost you 660 euros without tax if you choose to buy this one on the beads of rice bracelet, which is what I did. Now, it's a little bit cheaper if you buy it on the rubber strap or if you buy it on a different strap. But I'm going to talk to you more about that at the end of the video. So let's put that conversation aside for the moment and let's flip the camera and let's jump into the full review of my Aquascaphe. So on paper, the Baltic Aquascaphe Classic Blue Gilt has a lot going for it. It's got a double dome sapphire crystal, high beat Miyota, 200 meters of water resistance, a 2-year warranty, and a really cool vintage look to it. But in reality, what it comes down to for me, especially with these sort of micro brands, is the details, and Baltic does really well here. Look at the packaging. It's really, really pleasant, really nice, a little bit different, a little bit more sort of unique. Inside here, in the lid of it, or the base of it here, we've got a nice sort of manual, got our warranty stuff in there. But then underneath, look at that. There's actually a spot specifically for your spare links, and they do a little bit of a graph of what your movement is performing like when it goes or leaves the factory. I think that's pretty cool. But obviously we're here to see the watch, and it presents really nicely in this packaging here on that sort of angle, and that's pretty cool. So I'm going to start off talking about the dimensions of this watch first, because I think it is an integral part of why this watch fits on wrist the way it does, looks the way it does, and has a real sort of that vintage vibes to it. Because this one here has a 38mm case diameter, but the bezel sticks over a little bit. If you see that there, you'll see the bezel sticks out past the case, making the bezel 39.5mm. The width of the watch is 13.3mm, but there's a lot of the double dome sapphire crystal there, because without the sapphire crystal, it's 11mm. Lug to lug is 46.9mm, which is a nice fit for most wrists, especially because it has those female end links with that lug width of 20mm. And on this bracelet, if you choose to buy this bracelet, which I think you should because it is a really, really nice bracelet, it is 124 grams. Yeah, so those vintage vibes really start with those dimensions, but then they continue with the look and the dial of this one. And at first glance, if you check out this dial, it has a fairly simple dial to it. But it has a bit of a trick up its sleeve, or actually it has two tricks up its sleeve, because when you stick it in the sunlight, that blue dial, it really transforms and you really see something quite special about it. But under the studio lights, it looks fairly sort of muted, just a nice blue, nothing too outrageous, but the sun hits it and it sort of transforms. Also, it is actually a sandwich dial, because there's 3 parts of this that is under a sandwich. You'll see those triangles at the 3, 6 and 9. They are actually set underneath the dial, whereas everything else on here is printed in that sort of faux tina with that bit of loom. So we got a minute track around the outside. It's almost like a railway track almost, with the hour markers being a little bit longer than the minutes. The other dots there are just printed on there, Baltic, automatic, and 200 meters. So you sort of think, oh, okay, it's all sort of faux tina, looks okay, but then you add those little triangles that are sort of set downwards below the rest of the dial, and it gives it something a little bit extra special, especially when you're talking about the hands being relatively simple as well, these sort of sword style, also with photina in there as well, and a pop of little lollipop photina on that second hand. Those hands are all polished stainless steel, and I really like the lengths of them. If you look at the second hand, really hits that outer minute track. Minute hand hits just the inside of that minute track, and the hour hand is just a really nice. And you'll see when I turn now to look at the loom, it's actually surprisingly how good it is. This photina sometimes isn't quite as bright as other forms of loom, but this one, really good. I'm really happy with the loom on this watch. And that dial is all covered by this nice piece of almost vintage sort of style double dome sapphire crystal, or at least it has a bit of a vintage look to it. They really are sort of piling on the sort of vintage aesthetics to this one, and I think it works really well without being too much, but it's really nice, really feels good, looks good, and what it does is it really curves down to then meet this bezel. And I really like this bezel. It's not particularly thick, but they've surrounded it by a piece of stainless steel on both sides, so you've got to, it breaks it up a little bit. That's actually part of the bezel there. So you got a nice little piece of sapphire crystal going down into a nice little piece of stainless steel, then going back out to that nice dark blue bezel there. And that dark blue bezel looks so cool because it is also sapphire. So you've got sapphire and sapphire next to each other, and it does look really cool. It's quite thin, has a coin edge bezel, not too many markings on it. We just got the triangle, a couple of dots, 15, 30 and 45, just enough to set off the bezel, just enough to sort of set off the outside of that dial there. And the bezel action is really nice. It's actually probably one of the nicer bezel actions that I've experienced on any of the sort of Microbrands or any sort of watch that's under $1,000 really. No backplay whatsoever, no movement, very nice to utilize and very easy to utilize as well. And of course, not too sloppy either or anything. It doesn't move and it's not going to be knocked and moved just by hitting it either. And when you flip this one onto its side, you're going to see a nice slim profile there, all brushed there, which is rather nice, and drilled end lugs, which to me is a little bit of a surprise. I don't think this watch particularly needs it, especially when you pop underneath there and you can actually see these are a quick release spring bars on the bracelet. So I'm not sure why they've chosen to do that. I think it breaks up that a little bit. But if you are swapping to different types of leather straps or other leather straps, then I guess it's going to be quite helpful. Obviously, same on the other side. There is an unguarded crown there, nice sort of big B there on that screw down crown. See, there's unguarded, but it is screw down, very easy to access and use as well. Having the Miyota 9039 is good for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it does have hand winding. It also does have hacking, and there's no ghost position, which is really cool. But let's see how this Miyota is performing on the time grapher. So I think it's actually running okay, not perfectly, but okay. You can see it's a high beat, 28,800 vibrations per hour. A little bit of beat error, 0.4, it's under 1, so it's okay, but obviously 0 is better. Amplitude is perfectly fine, and it's running about +8 to +10 seconds a day, which it's okay for this movement. I'm perfectly satisfied with that, but it's nice to be able to see that it is obviously a high beat movement, not too much beat error, but it is good to have that good, healthy amplitude. And we move on to this Beads of Rice bracelet. It really is a standout feature for me because we do have solid end links which fit super, super tight into that case. We have polished down the center, brushed on the sides, brushed on further on the sides. Very small links. You can see they're very small. They're all individual links as well, making it super, super comfortable on wrist. There is a little bit of taper. There's a little bit of movement there, which again makes it really nice and comfortable on wrist. As I also mentioned, there is quick release spring bars there, making it easy to pull this one off wrist. And then we come to this clasp, which I have to admit, I love, but I hate. I love the fact that it is really well made, brushed there with some high polish on the sides, Baltic. I love specifically how thin it is because it's basically the same thickness as the bracelet, so it sits on wrist beautifully. Heaps of micro adjusts, and when you include the small links there and the micro adjust, you're pretty much guaranteed to get a good fit. But I hate it because it's one of these friction locks which you have to get your thumb under there and you break your thumb off. Oh, ow. I know there's other ways to do that, but it's, you know, it's nice to have the double pushes and it just feels nice and easy to use when you do that. However, by not having the double pushes, it's able to become that thin, which is nice. All solid inside, as you can see. Yes, really just a nice looking and feeling bracelet, something that I'm really, really happy with. Yes, I'm occasionally losing a thumbnail, but once it's on wrist, it is wonderful. Cool case back as well with that scuba diver, some sort of other sort of patterns there, which I think looks good, and of course some details about the watch and the movement. And with all those features, including the bracelet, the clasp, and these dimensions, it looks absolutely fantastic, sits really nicely, feels really good on my 6 3/4 or around about 17 centimeter wrist. Certainly no complaints with how this one feels or looks on wrist. In fact, it is just a pleasure to wear. And I really do appreciate that slim clasp when it is actually on wrist. Super comfortable with that beads of rice as well. Just a lovely watch to wear, look down at, and actually just feel, even when you're not looking at it. It's just a lovely watch to feel on wrist. So what do I like about this one? What don't I like? And what would I change? Well, there's a fair bit to like here. I really like the subtle details of this one. And I do like subtle details because I think it really helps make a watch move from being good to being great. Things like those sort of sandwich dial there, those 3 sections there. Very, very cool. Catching that dial in the sun and seeing it glint away. That's really nice. This beads of rice bracelet is particularly nice. And although it does annoy me sometimes, that clasp there being so thin is absolutely a standout feature. I like how they chose to go with the high bit Miyota movement with no ghost position as well. It really does add to the experience of having this watch on wrist. But what don't I like? Well, there's a couple of things. Price. This watch is not exactly cheap. It's not exactly cheap when you're comparing it against other watches. It's not exactly cheap when you're comparing it against other micro-brand watches. So that's a little bit of a concern. I personally don't really like the jeweled end lugs. I think some watches really sort of suit it and it's really helpful. This one, not so much. I don't think it really needed it. And I didn't mention about how this bracelet is put together. It uses push pins. Now, I think it uses push pins because these links are so small. If they were going to be screw links, it would be a teeny tiny screwdriver. So I kind of get that, although I always do miss having screw links whenever they don't have screw links. So what would I change about this one? Well, there's probably not that much, to be honest. I think there's actually not that much to change. Even though I may not like everything about it, there's not much I'd go, oh, I'd prefer that, prefer that, prefer that. Yes, okay, double pushes on this would be great, but I think it would then take away from that slimness. Yes, I'd remove the jeweled end lugs, but that is a personal choice. I do think, however, a polished chamfered edge would really set this one off even further. So that's probably the real only change I'd make to this watch, specifically a bit of a chamfered edge, because you could then have this nice brushing, because there's a bit of brushing on the top there, nice brushing on the sides, but then you've got this polish down the center of this bracelet, and to link in with a little bit of polishing there, I think that would be really good. But I really want to talk a little bit more about the price of this watch, because I think it is something that is definitely going to be a consideration if you're thinking about buying one of these or any of the Baltics. But let's flip back to me now to talk more in depth about that price. Now, I bought my Aquascaphe second-hand. It came on the Beads of Rice bracelet and I got it at a reasonable price. But if you're going to buy this one brand new from the Baltic website, it's 660 euros. That does include the extra bracelet, so it's a little bit cheaper without it, but that is without tax. So it's 660 euros with the bracelet, which you want because it's really good, plus tax. And I have to admit, when I was looking at it brand new before I even found it on the used market, I thought that was a little bit expensive. But then when I had it in hand, after I'd purchased it, I started to realize that this watch is something a little bit special. It is really, really well made. It has a lovely bracelet on it. I like the details on it. And I thought, okay, I'm starting to understand why they're asking this amount of money for it. But the problem I have is that when I start to think about comparing it against other watches, there's one watch that comes to my mind straight away. A watch that I've owned and I absolutely love, and it's 1/3 of the price of this Baltic. It is also a vintage-inspired diver. It has a very similar sort of look, give or take, without some of the details, however. Has the same sort of dimensions. The quality certainly feels the same. Different movements, however. This other watch is Seiko powered, whereas the Baltic is Miyota high beat powered. But for 1/3 of the price, you can buy this watch. And it has the same feel on wrist. And I enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed this watch. However, it is from Aliexpress. It is a San Martin watch, the San Martin Vintage Diver. And I understand you may not want to own a San Martin versus maybe a Baltic, but for 1/3 of the price, for the same sort of feel on wrist, for something that is going to fit my collection in the same way as this Baltic, it starts to struggle for me to start to understand why I would spend 3 times the amount of money on this Baltic. Don't get me wrong, I think it's a great watch. I really enjoy it. And getting it the price that I got it at makes that a little bit better. But even on the second-hand market, I paid almost twice the amount of this San Martin. And to be honest, if you're on a budget, I'd recommend the San Martin. If you're not as much on a budget and you prefer Microbrands over Aliexpress, which I understand, then maybe it is actually worthwhile. And guys, if you enjoyed this video, maybe check these ones out next.